There is something I kept returning to across decades of practice. Not a theory, a pattern, a quiet, almost embarrassing pattern that showed up again and again in the most ordinary people who came to sit across from me. They already knew. That was the thing that never stopped unsettling me. They already knew what they needed to know. And yet something inside them had learned to mistrust that knowing so completely that they could no longer hear it clearly. They had been taught, not always through words, to doubt themselves. I have spent my life mapping the unconscious. I have followed its signals through dreams, through symptoms, through the strange coincidences that gather around a person when their inner life demands attention. But of all the mechanisms I studied, the one I found most quietly destructive was this one, the systematic erosion of a person's trust in their own perception. It does not announce itself. It arrives slowly. And by the time most people recognize it, they have been living inside it for years. Let me tell you what I mean. In my practice in Zurich, I saw a man named Otto, who was in his late 50s when he first came to me. He was a careful man, measured. He chose his words the way a watchmaker chooses his tools. He had spent 30 years in a marriage where every observation he made about his own experience was returned to him as a question. Are you sure that is what happened? Do you really feel that way? You always exaggerate. He did not come to me because he recognized any of this. He came because he could no longer make decisions, simple decisions. What to order at a restaurant, which route to take to work. The mechanism that generates confidence in one's own judgment had been so thoroughly undermined that it had nearly stopped functioning entirely. And when I asked him what he actually thought about the central conflict in his life, he said something I have never forgotten. He said, I used to know, but I stopped trusting it, so eventually it stopped coming. Stay with me, because the next part changes the meaning of everything I have just described. What Otto experienced was not weakness. It was not a failure of intelligence or character. It was the result of a specific psychological process that I came to understand very well over the course of my career. When a person's perceptions are consistently questioned, minimized, or reframed by someone close to them, the psyche does something intelligent and ultimately costly. It begins to root its conclusions through an external check. Instead of arriving at a perception and trusting it, the person begins to ask silently, but is this right? Would someone else agree? Am I seeing this correctly? That pause, repeated thousands of times, becomes a habit. And eventually, the habit becomes the architecture of how the mind works. If you have found this kind of thinking familiar in your own life, I would be glad if you subscribe to this channel, because what I am about to describe goes considerably deeper. The question I want to ask you is not whether this has happened to you. I suspect many of you already sense that it has. The question I want to ask is, when did you first learn to root your knowing through someone else's approval before you allowed yourself to believe it? Think of a moment in your life when you knew something clearly and then talked yourself out of it. Not because you found a better argument against your perception, but because someone you trusted made you feel uncertain. It may have been a parent who told you that you were too sensitive. It may have been a partner who explained your own feelings back to you in ways that felt slightly wrong, but were delivered with such confidence that you accepted them. It may have been something smaller. A room where your instincts were never taken seriously. A family where one person's version of events was always the version that stood. If you are sitting with this and it feels immediately recognizable, that recognition is itself a form of knowing. Notice that you did not have to think very hard. Something in you already understood what I was describing before I finished describing it. If it is harder to locate, that is also meaningful. Some people have been living inside this pattern for so long that the original signal has become very faint. Not gone, faint. There is a difference, and I want to be precise about it. But here is what most people miss entirely. The loss of trust in one's own perception does not only affect large decisions. This is where people tend to underestimate the damage. They think, well, I know my own mind about the important things. Perhaps I second guess myself in small matters, but surely not about what is real. And yet this is precisely backwards. The pattern begins in small matters and moves inward. It starts with whether your version of an argument is accurate. Then it moves to whether your emotional responses are proportionate. Then to whether your judgments of people can be trusted. Then finally to something more fundamental, to whether you can trust the quiet voice that tells you what you want, what you need, what is true for you. When it reaches that level, a person loses something very hard to name and even harder to recover without effort. They lose what I called in my notes on individuation the direct line to the self. That line is not dramatic. It does not speak in urgent tones. It is the quiet current underneath daily life that tells you yes or no, toward or away, this or not this. And when that current has been interrupted long enough, a person begins to feel what Otto felt. Not broken exactly, but somehow operating on borrowed terms, making choices that look reasonable from the outside but feel hollow from the inside, going through the days with a low, almost unnameable sense that they are slightly beside themselves rather than inside themselves. I want to pause here and say something that I think deserves particular care. This is not a condition unique to unusual people or unusual circumstances. I saw it in highly educated individuals. I saw it in people who were professionally confident, even admired. I saw it in people who would have been surprised and perhaps offended to hear me describe it this way. The external self can remain functional and even impressive, while the internal relationship to one's own knowing has been deeply compromised. The two are not the same thing, and conflating them is one of the ways this pattern stays hidden. Now let me tell you what happens when the erosion stops. In a moment you will see why this matters more than most people expect. Otto spent 14 months working through what had happened to his perception. I want to be honest that it was not a comfortable process. Recovering trust in one's own knowing, after years of having it questioned, requires something that feels almost paradoxical. You have to begin acting on your perceptions before you fully trust them again. You cannot wait for the trust to return and then act. The trust returns through the action, through the experience of making a judgment, following it, and discovering that it was sound. I used to ask patients to begin with very small moments, not the large decisions, something simple. You think it will rain? Do not check what someone else thinks. Observe the sky and make your own assessment. You sense that a conversation has a particular feeling to it. Do not immediately look for confirmation. Sit with your own reading of it and see what develops. These are not important acts in themselves, but they are practice in the most literal sense. They rebuild a channel that has been allowed to fill with sediment. The woman I will call Ingrid, who was in her early 70s when she came to me, described this process with a precision that I found remarkable. She said that for the first several weeks, it felt like trying to use a hand that had fallen asleep. She could feel the signals, but they arrived with a kind of static, a layer of interference that made her doubt whether she was receiving them correctly. And then gradually, the static cleared. Not all at once, in patches. She would have a moment of clean perception, followed by more uncertainty, followed by another clear moment. And over time, the clear moments became more frequent than the interference. What she was describing was the gradual restoration of what I call the direct line to the self. It had not been destroyed, it had been buried. And uncovering it was less like learning something new and more like remembering something very old. Stay with me, because the next part changes the meaning of what recovery actually requires. I want to say something about the people who did the burying, because I think it is important and because I want to be precise. In the great majority of cases I saw, the people who systematically questioned another person's perceptions were not doing so as a calculated strategy. They were doing so because their own relationship to reality required it. When a person cannot tolerate another person's independent perception, it is almost always because that perception threatens something in them. A self-image they have constructed carefully. A version of events that protects them from something they do not want to see. The questioning is defensive, not predatory, though the effect on the recipient is no less corrosive for that. This distinction matters because it changes how one makes sense of what happened. The person who taught you to doubt yourself was not in most cases a monster. They were someone whose own psychological needs required that your version of reality be subordinate to theirs. That is not an excuse, but it is an explanation. And explanations, when accurate, tend to be more useful than moral categories. What I want you to take from this is not that the damage does not matter. It does. What I want you to take is that the damage was not the verdict on you. It was the consequence of proximity to someone else's unprocessed interior. You became, in my language, a container for something that was not yours. And containers can be emptied. But here is what most people miss entirely when they try to do this work. The recovery of trust in one's own knowing is not primarily an intellectual project. I have seen many people who understood everything I have described with great clarity and still could not act on their own perceptions. They could trace exactly how they had come to doubt themselves. And then they would sit down to make a decision, and the old pause would return. Is this right? Am I sure? What would someone else think? Understanding is not the same as integration. This is one of the central lessons I drew from decades of watching people try to change. The mind can comprehend what the psyche has not yet absorbed. And the gap between those two things is where most healing work actually happens. It is not comfortable territory, but it is where the real movement occurs. There is a very small practice I want to offer you. It takes no more than a few minutes, and it does not require anything unusual. At some point today, you will have a perception about something, a sense of how a conversation went, a feeling about a choice you are considering, a quiet reading of a situation that you might ordinarily push aside because you are not certain enough to trust it. When that happens, I want you to write it down, not to analyze it, not to evaluate whether it is correct, simply to record that you had it in your own words before anything external has had a chance to modify it. That is all. What you are doing is creating a small record of your own knowing. You are giving it a form that exists independently of anyone else's confirmation. Over time, if you do this consistently, you will find that you can compare your initial perceptions with how things actually develop. And most people who do this discovered that their knowing was considerably more accurate than their doubt had led them to believe. It is a small thing, but so is a compass. And the value of a compass is not its size. I want to be careful here, because there is a version of this idea that gets misused. Some people hear that they should trust their own knowing and take it to mean that they are always right, that their first impression is infallible, that doubt itself is the enemy. That is not what I am saying. Doubt, properly understood, is a necessary function of a healthy mind. It is the instrument we use to refine our perceptions, to test them against new information, to hold them with appropriate flexibility. What I am describing is something different. It is the compulsive, reflexive undermining of one's own perception before it has even had a chance to be considered. The doubt that comes not from genuine uncertainty, but from the long training of being told that your version of things cannot be trusted. There is a difference between questioning a perception because you have good reason to, and questioning it because you have been conditioned to. Learning to tell those two things apart is itself a form of knowing, and it is, in my experience, one of the more demanding tasks that recovery from this kind of erosion actually requires. The psyche is extraordinarily patient. It will wait a very long time for the conditions that allow it to be heard. It does not abandon you when you stop listening. It simply waits. Sometimes it becomes louder through symptoms, through the body, through moments of unexpected emotion that seem disproportionate to their immediate cause. These are not failures of the system. They are the system insisting on being attended to. Before I close, I want to return to Otto. When I last saw him, some years after we had finished working together, he told me that the most surprising thing about recovering his trust in his own perception was how quiet it was. He had expected something more dramatic, more certain. What he found instead was simply that the pause had shortened. The question of whether he was right no longer preceded every judgment. He could simply know something, as one knows that it is morning when the light changes, without requiring a second opinion from the world. That is what I want for anyone who recognizes themselves in what I have described today. Not a dramatic transformation, not a new self, simply the quiet return of what was always there, waiting to be listened to again. If you recognize what I have described in your own life, I would like to know what you call that inner voice when it finally speaks clearly. Leave it in the comments below. There are patterns that follow naturally from what we have discussed today, particularly around the question of how the psyche signals through dreams and through the body when something is being suppressed that needs attention. That is a conversation worth continuing, if you are willing.